Hello and welcome to another edition of the Plus One interview. And today we've got a returning guest. My man Matt Feld from the Boston Herald is here. And we got a lot to talk about regarding high school sports. He's been busy keeping up with the MIA meetings, COVID-19 task force meetings, and so much going on, Matt. Just first off, they had the meetings last week. Just tell me the overall, just all about that meeting last week.
Yes, the MI Board of Directors met on Friday and kind of affirmed most of the COVID-19 task force's recommendations as it came to winter sports, which is that, first off, wrestling, which was deemed too high risk to play during the winter, will be moved to the spring season, which is actually pretty huge. It's pretty unusual ever for the MIA to move sports from one designated season to another, which is what's happening with wrestling. And then all of the sport modifications that were made for winter sports, basketball, ice hockey, boys and girls both, gymnastics, swimming and diving, alpine and Nordic skiing, those modifications were approved by the board of directors. And so as a result, they can get set to have their winter seasons, barring, of course, that their schools are respectively staying open. And they set a start date for winter sports of December 14th. So it's a 2-week delay from what we're usually accustomed to. 2 weeks from Thanksgiving break. And so the season for schools can begin if they elect to choose to do so on Monday, the 14th.
Because normally next week we'd be seeing these winter sports beginning as far as like preseason games or little trials, and then the week after they get into the fold of things. And you talked about some modifications. I'll let you get into some of those details with some of the others regarding some of the other sports. But in basketball, in reading the article you put out, there's a lot of modifications. It's a whole different sport. I'll just read just a few from your article that you posted last weekend. So there's no jump ball. Before the pre-games, one official and one captain from each team. No pre-game or post-game handshakes. The host schools have to set up a designated area for students for their mask breaks. 3 coaches allowed on the bench. It's a 6-quarter rule. It's suspended for this season. Home team has to provide 4 game balls. The basketballs will be wiped with disinfectants after each period. And also so many other modifications as far as free throw lines and inbound plays. It's going to look like a whole different sport.
Yeah, there are a lot of modifications for sure. Not quite as much as the fall, but there are still a lot, like you mentioned. No jump ball. There are mass breaks in between throughout the course of quarters. Halftime is greatly reduced. The time in between quarters is now 2.5 minutes as opposed to a minute, so students get more of a mass break. Balls are sanitized in between every quarter, like you said. There are no under the basket plays. All plays are inbounded from the sideline. You have to be 6 feet away as a defender when it comes to the inbounds play happening on the sideline. And so there are a number of modifications that have to be put into place. There's roster size limits. So 15 is the max that can dress on a game. Only 3 coaches on the bench, like you said. For some, that's not a big deal. Some teams you'll see they have like 14 coaches on the bench, and 12 of them are to make sure that they're color coordinated with one another. Yeah. And for some programs that'll be a big deal. But you're right. There's a lot of modifications in hockey. The biggest modifications mostly came with the amount of players that you could dress, because of the fact that rinks are so tight. It's really hard to socially distance on the bench in hockey. Those hockey benches are usually really narrow. They're really restrictive. Players are usually packed in on top of one another. And so that was the biggest concern with the hockey modifications, was trying to find a way where players could still socially distance on the bench. No use of the penalty box, no scrums of more than 2 people, at least 6 feet apart on the face-offs, unless you're participating in the face-off. And so there are numerous, those 2 sports were the sports that received the heaviest modifications. Like I said earlier, wrestling already moving to the spring, that'll deal with its own modifications when the time comes. But those 2 sports in particular had needed the most modifications because of the amount of contact. Hockey, you've got checking, and of course in basketball, you've got rebounding on every possession. And so a lot of modifications, like you said, had to be put into place for those sports.
And also, this also will have an impact on the JV and schools that have freshmen, because it seems like those might not even happen. Or can you just talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the modification ramifications are probably greater on lower levels, particularly maybe if you had like a younger player that you wanted to have play up for the year. because of the roster limit size now. That's probably a lot more unlikely. One thing, too, that's going to be interesting to see is that there's going to be staggered start times between games because you can't have freshman fans sticking around for the varsity game. And so there's a very high unlikelihood that freshmen or JV lower levels may not be able to stick around and watch, the varsity team play, and that has an influence on younger level programs as well. If we're talking about transportation costs, so if you can't have the lower levels sticking around and traveling with the varsity team for the varsity games, you have to take 3 separate buses to a certain road venue. So maybe you can only play 6 or 8, freshman games, as opposed to for varsity if you're playing maybe 12, 14, or 16. So you're right. There's no question about it. I think the lower levels are going to be the ones that are impacted by the most by the modifications, just like they were in the fall in some instances, and not just, and maybe more so than the varsity teams.
Yeah, what have you heard from some of the coaches about these modifications? What's been some of the reviews or just the feedback that you've received from the coaches that the hockey coaches or the basketball coaches?
Well, I think for the most part, coaches are just happy to be playing. I think at this point, their fingers crossed that the season will actually come around. There certainly are concerns in terms of the fact that they're going to have to teach their players, to some respects, a different game. They're going to have to teach their players how to get used to wearing a mask. They're going to have to get used to not running any under the basket plays. They're going to have to get used to finding kind of the right we talked about, a roster limit. Do you play less kids because you're playing, a shorter season? Do you play more kids because this is a season that doesn't have a tournament at the end of the year? That's something that coaches are really going to have to navigate. Again, I think coaches are happy to be playing, at least scheduled to have a season. I think that's the biggest win here overall. But I think there's still a number of factors that have to be sort of figured out as from a coaching perspective in terms of what you're trying to get out of this year when you're working with your players. Again, there's no MI tournament. A lot of leagues are having tournaments on their own. So you have to decide what type of year you want this to be. Is this a year where all the seniors get to play, as much as possible, regardless of maybe ability? Is this a year when you're really developing your program instead? So that's something that coaches are really going to have to grapple with throughout the winter months.
And also there's going to be certain, because the modifications have been approved, but there's still another hurdle that some areas have to battle. Areas like Lynn have to battle. Like Lynn is in the red right now. There's still remote learning. So that's another aspect of this, because if they're not in school, or if they're not, doing half remote and half in-person learning, can they even have a season if they're not in school at some point?
Yeah, that's going to be up to each individual. So if you're in the red, like you said, and as a result, maybe you don't have in-person learning, or maybe you're not in the red, but you still don't have in-person learning. The big difference here now, that the problem that schools are going to run into as opposed to fall sports, is that these sports use the building, right? Basketball is inside the gym. So if your school's not open because of the fact that you are remote, because you're in a high-risk area, you're in a red area, your school committee is elected that it's not safe for the kids to be in the school building, well, now you have to convince the building principal, the superintendent, that it's then safe to have a basketball game later that night still. And that's kind of the tough thing. You're not now having kids, working athletically outside. You now bring them actually into the school in a district where you've determined it's not safe to have kids in the classroom. And that, to me, is probably going to be the biggest hurdle, like you said, that most districts have to clear. Like in Lynn, if you're in the red there, you have to find a way to either get kids back in the classroom to some extent, or convince your athletic director, your building principal, your superintendent, the district, the school committee, that even though we don't have kids in the classroom, it's still okay to bring 30, 40 kids in there, either after school for practice or for a game, in order to allow basketball, in this case, to take place.
Yeah, and also they might end up having to play road games for the entire season, because
right.
You can't do nothing if the school's not open, the administration's not going to open it. So the only thing to do is get road games, but the scheduling aspect too, that's to be something also that's going to hinder some teams.
Yeah, scheduling is going to be a big factor here. I think once again, like the fall, we expect most teams to play inside their league. There might be some circumstances where if you're a school that's closer to others that's in another league, that might be a different scenario. If you're right down the street, even though you're not in your league, you might play them a couple times. But I'm still expecting for this winter most teams to only play league games, maybe play them twice. You end up playing 12, 14, 16 games. You said a scheduling scenarios where your gym's not open on certain days. Can we use we'll work as the home team on the road though? Do we have to find different facilities to play games at? What if some hockey rinks close down over the winter? All right. What if some swimming pools closed down over the winter. This is something that every sport's going to have to deal with. Every athletic director and coach is going to have to deal with on a daily basis as the circumstances constantly change. And so that's one thing that I'm going to be interested to see is kind of how each of these schools handle the fact that they're not all going to have equal access to the gym. They're not all going to have equal access to facilities. So how do we still have a winter season at a time when a fair amount of facilities are going to continue to close down, at least for short periods of time, if numbers pertaining to COVID continue to increase?
And can you've been covering the teams that were able, the schools that were able to have fall sports. Can you just overall, how did you think those schools handled everything in as far as keeping students safe and putting together a season?
I thought for the most part, they did a great job. And most players and coaches I talked to throughout the course of the fall, once the season actually got started and they saw either other states that weren't playing or districts that had to get shut down or districts that elected not to play sports at all, they were really grateful just to be able to be out there having a season, especially these leagues that put on postseason tournaments, the Hockomock League, the NEC, the CCL, the Patriot League. They put on a really solid display for their kids, putting in an entertaining league tournament format to finish off the season. And I think all the coaches and players that competed in those tournaments absolutely loved it. There were hiccups along the way. There were numerous programs that got shut down for certain periods of time. And there were instances where, a kid got sick after a game was over. And then everyone that participated in that game, even the opposing team, had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And so questions were raised of, even if what's the point of these sport modifications if you still have to quarantine after someone gets sick? Why does the opponent have to quarantine if the whole point of the modifications is to stop the spread? And so that's been probably the biggest controversy that's come out of the fall is, what's the point of these modifications if both teams are still quarantining after, one player gets sick on both teams? But overall, for the most part, I think programs did a really good job of finding ways to keep their kids on the field, keep their kids in the classroom. I think we continue to see that the more that they're affiliated with their schools, whether it be in athletics, but most importantly, again, in the actual classroom itself, the less to be in positions where they can acquire the virus and then spread the virus. That continues to be harped on by Governor Charlie Baker from data that he's seen both in state and out of state. And so hopefully that's a positive step forward, that even as cases rise in Massachusetts and throughout New England, we find a way to have a successful winter sports season, knowing how important it is for these kids to be with their fellow classmates and fellow teammates, and maybe away from, any basement activities that could lead to further spreads of COVID.
Yeah, that's definitely. And lastly, there was also some news out of the NEC last week. They approved 12-0 to let Lynn English and Lynn Classical move on to the Greater Boston League. They could have kept them for another 2 years, but they decided to let them move on. Can you just talk about their mindset or their thinking of just voting unanimously to have them leave the conference to go to the GBL?
Yeah, pretty interesting news, kind of developments that have come about over the last couple of months. Like you said, they could have had them stay for another 2 years and then have them leave going into 2022, or 2023, I should say. I think this is probably not an overall huge surprise across the board in terms of the fact that they're moving into the GBL. Perhaps how quickly this sort of came together is a surprise. It certainly changes things when you look at the NEC, when you're looking at teams that are consistently at the top in some sports as opposed to others. Of course, Lynn English has become a power in basketball in the NEC, and so there'll certainly be ramifications for that down the road. The GBL is a league that shrank in recent years, especially once Everett left, or not Everett left, but once some teams started discussing mergers with the NEC and moving conferences around from the GBL to the NEC, and so certainly that became that those two conferences have really been at the forefront in terms of conference realignment over the last couple of years, and so there's certainly going to be ramifications. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not these help more of the programs within Lynn become competitive, particularly when you're looking at potential competition, schools similar in size. And so I think that's going to be the big thing, is Lynn will probably be playing schools now that are a little more similar in size to them than they're seeing in the NEC. Some of these NEC schools are usually smaller, lower division schools, Division 4, Division 5, Division 6. Now Lynn will be playing some bigger schools like Malden and Chelsea, who maybe not be on a year in, year out basis standing out athletically overall from a record standpoint, but certainly from an enrollment size, certainly more of their billing. So moving to a smaller conference, moving to a conference that has less games, which means these schools will have to find more out-of-conference games. But certainly a significant development because Lynn's been part of the NEC for so long, I think since the early 1970s, that they'll be joining a new conference, and certainly exciting for them.
Yeah, definitely. And lastly, what's next for as far as MIA board meetings? When's the next ones coming up, and what are the discussions for the next meetings?
Well, there are currently no impromptu ones planned at the moment, so that's good. The fact of the matter is there's no currently scheduled board meetings until January, which will be the board's regularly scheduled meetings. It's unlikely the board will convene again before then unless there's a reason to postpone or cancel winter sports. And so if there is another meeting, the odds are it's not good news before then. And so for now, the board is just going to go about doing its regular business as we head into 2021, and hope that the winter athletic year kicks off on Monday, December 14th without any major issues.
All right, and there we go. Matt, thank you once again for coming on. Please let them plug in your social media and where they can find your work.
Yeah, of course. My Twitter is Matty Feld, 612, MATTYFELD 612. You can find my work at the Boston Herald. I work for Danny Ventura, the sports editor there. Feel free to always drop me any hints or storylines into my direct messages at any time, and I will hopefully get back to you as soon as possible.
All right, that's Matt Feld. You guys been watching another edition of the Plus One interview. Have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.